I would spend so many hours there, even besides the time we were in the school, because that was when we had fun. We would be playing in the yard, or we were playing ping pong downstairs in the basement, or running around in the gymnasium. So there was really a vibrant experience for a youngster growing up in those days. I recall very vividly arguments I would have with my older brother at the time that I was maybe 8 or 9 or 10 years of age. And I'd say to him, Rube, there are more Jews living in Minneapolis than there are non-Jews. And he would say, no, there are more non-Jews living in Minneapolis than there are Jews. And I would say, but how could that be? My world was that little north side area.
I made friends in Tamatora from the first day I started that are friends today. I even proudly exhibit my Tamatora pin that we got when we graduated from Tamatora. I loved every minute I went there. I know a lot of people look at me and say, oh, come on, you didn't love it every minute. And I say, yes, I did. I really enjoyed going. The one thing that I really loved is I had Mark Haas. I started at Bethel Synagogue. And from the first day we entered, he said to us, I will talk to you in English for 10 minutes, and we will not talk English after that, or speak English. And he said, I will tell you 2 words, Zeh and Od Pam. And from now on, we do not speak English. And from then on, it was great. We learned to talk Hebrew. And not only that, we learned the history in Hebrew, everything. That's what I pass on to my children. The way we conduct our holiday traditions was brought out by the Talmud Torah. There was no 2 ways. My children were sent to the Talmud Torah. And the fact that I go to Sabbath services practically every week. Although I started when I was 5 years old going to Shabbat services, it was enhanced by the fact that now I know what I'm talking about. And that's, I feel, the result of going to the Talmud Torah.
In the 1920s, that's precisely what happened. There were young students having services at Talmud Torah, but they were getting together and they were looking for a more modern, meaningful service. And so they came together and had services there. Then their parents began to join them in services. And that's really the beginning. It was called the Young People's Synagogue. They kept records, in fact. They kept a ledger, and it said Young People's Synagogue, Young People's Synagogue. I found it in an old closet at Bethel, and if you turn the page, Young People's Synagogue, there it said Bethel Synagogue. So it actually, even the ledger showed that it actually went from one to the other. And what happened is the parents and the young people felt that really they couldn't continue at the Talmud Torah anymore. There wasn't enough room. It was time to have their own synagogue. And so they moved over to 14th and 10th, near where you lived, as I remember, and bought a small house on the corner and the land. Then they also had fundraising and a building committee, and ultimately by 1924 or so, they built the synagogue, and actually it was complete by 1926, so there was actually that large synagogue there. And again, that grew over the years until, again, they were too crowded, and in 1948 added the extra portion that most of us remember.
It was an exciting place to grow up as a youngster because all of the shuls were active and were vibrant. And I can remember very well, frequently, we would start from Aldrich or Lyndale Avenue, where the Knesset Israel was at that time located, and walk through to the Bethel on Penn, particularly the Talmud Torah kids, because that was kind of fun on the high holidays, on Pesach and on Shavuos, and during the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur holidays. And they would go shul hopping from one shul to the next. And we'd stop at the Mikra Kodesh, and we'd stop at the Tiferes B'nai Jacob, and stop at the, finally get to the Bethel, and that would sort of be the last location.
Oh, in those days, all the Jewish people took an active part in their shul. And as a child, I remember, as this man said, during the high holidays, going from shul to shul. The reason for it was that although we were attending Talmud Torah, we didn't understand the service at all. In the Orthodox shul, they had no English. And I remember, particularly at the Mikra Kodesh, the Einiklach, the grandchildren running up and down the aisles on the main floor, and then running upstairs to the balcony where the women were davening, because in those days, men and women did not daven on the same floor. And it wasn't until later on, after the war, I believe, boys coming back from service weren't that interested in Orthodox shul anymore, and a lot of them joined the Beth El, the Daf Sharon, and the temple. I remember that very clearly.
By the time I was a teenager, the Knesset Israel Synagogue had fallen down in the number and in some of its activities, so the Knesset was really kind of a remote place to reach, because the neighborhood had gotten a little bit run down in my times in the late 40s and early 50s, and in fact they shortly thereafter sold the building to the highway department, and then they bought land, I believe it was either on Thomas or on Sheridan, to build a new building, but they got a foundation dug and the building never got built, and they bought the church on Queen Avenue for their services in those years prior to their going out to the St. Louis Park area. But the Knesset Israel was a very vibrant shul in its earlier years, and in fact it was called the Mother Shul. So many of the shuls later on derived its membership from people who were leaving the Knesset Israel shul because they were really considerably out of the pale of settlement of the Jewish community on the north side. Lyndale and Aldrich and Bryant were the first to deteriorate, to lose its real Jewish identity. And the people who were going to those shuls moved further to the west and to the north and attended the Mikra Kodesh and the Tiferes B'nai Jacob and Sharei Tzedek synagogues.
Well, the move from Bethel was a gradual move. It was piecemeal. They began, first of all, realizing, as everyone has said, there was a migration from North Minneapolis to St. Louis Park. So you have migration. You have fewer and fewer people living close to the synagogue, and so for a few years there, we were busing the kids in from the suburbs even to Saturday school, even to Shabbat services. They were coming in on buses. They were adding choirs. They were doing all sorts of things to bring the kids, and to bring the adults back up north for services. But you still had kind of a divided synagogue. And eventually, it was time to move the entire synagogue. I would say that the problems on the north side, in the 60s, were part of that too. It became difficult for people to go to services. It became dangerous towards the end. I know that Cass and Shirley Abelson were escorted on Shabbat evening from the synagogue to their home, back and forth by the police. So towards the end, it really wasn't even a really safe place. And ultimately, that was probably the final blow. And in 1967, they were able to sell the building to the city of Minneapolis, and at that time the final move occurred with the building of a sanctuary.
In 1972, I returned from Israel, and it was the summertime, and I was walking Frank, the dog, and I didn't go to services that morning, but I did happen to walk in front of the Tifereth. Walked inside, they were on Xerxes, walked inside, the dog waited outside, and I wasn't dressed for shul, but I did happen to hear Rabbi Liephofer give the final sermon that he gave, and he bid farewell to the community, and that was the end of the Tifereth. Of course, they merged with B'nai Emet and moved to St. Louis Park. So that was summer of 1972.
Okay.
And it must have been that fall that Richard told me about this minyan that was meeting, and Richard recalls that he heard about it because
Max.
Yes, he had a neighbor named Max Shemranow who was attending this minyan and eventually needed a little bit of help getting there. And Richard and I both helped him, as well as meeting Reverend Fishhout one day.
Rabbi Fishhout. Rabbi Fishhout was from Vilna, and he spoke with a very heavy Yiddish accent, and he was short, very short man. And I remember waiting on the corner of Golden Valley Road and Penn for the bus, the number 19 bus to go downtown. And Reb Fishhout, I'd gotten back from Israel, and I had lived in a religious community there for a while, and Reb Fishhout, this rabbi with a round hat, starts talking to me. You could see I had a beard and two Jews on a bus, and he invited me to come to the minyan, told me where it was, and I discovered that Max had been involved in it.
Yes. The minyan, when we first started attending, which was in the basement of a home on 10th and Thomas, had about, I would guess, maybe on a good day, when the weather was good, 15, 16
What do you mean
participants.
10th? There's 11th and Thomas.
In the middle. And occasionally women attended as well, but it was essentially a men's minion.
The official would breathe tefillah.
It was wonderful.
Yeah.
It was very intense. I would say there were two very important lessons about the minion that really are difficult to learn in other contexts. The first was that there was absolutely no place or need for pretension here, because there was no one to impress. There was no reason to pretend. It was as clean and clear and simple as davening in somebody's basement, which is what we were doing. And that was a very important lesson, what it's like to daven without any concern for pretense. And the second lesson was that this was a minion that needed you. It was obvious that you were needed, and that if you were gone, they missed you. They asked about you. They called you sometimes to make sure that you were available if they were concerned that there wouldn't be enough people for a given occasion. If you were young, just the presence of young people was inspiring for the older members of the minion. That was a very important life lesson that I don't think I could have learned in another congregational setting. That Jewish life can flourish without pretense, and that there are places where you are absolutely needed. And finally, the last home of the minion was on 19th and Vincent, Golden Valley Road and Vincent, in a storage room of an apartment building where Mr. Joe Whites lived, who was also a member of the minion. And my last high holidays with the minion were in that storage room.
How long did the minion last?
About 10 years. About 10 years.
From when till?
From 1972 to 1982. From the time Knesset Israel left the North Side till, I believe, 1982.